Hi, Dr. Arland here, and I want to explain functional deficiencies versus borderline deficiencies. This is one of the most key pieces to understand when it comes to looking at micronutrient tests. And what we really want to do is understand first, what does a functional deficiency truly mean? Next, what does a borderline deficiency truly mean? And then third, what do these markers explain to us about the trajectory of this patient's health and how we should intervene for them? So let me take each one of these individually. So first, let's talk about a functional deficiency. Functional deficiencies may be simply looked at as the worst level of a deficiency. The way we should best think about these is that a functional deficiency implies that at no time is there adequate supply of a particular nutrient such that it would be able to efficiently support a metabolic pathway. So for example, let's take magnesium. Magnesium is, in this example, a cofactor for the Krebs cycle. It's a vital component to energy production. If someone has a functional magnesium deficiency, the points in the Krebs cycle that are magnesium dependent are always impaired. The Krebs cycle is never turning at an efficient enough pace with that magnesium deficiency present. So we always want to address magnesium deficiencies, and more importantly, we want to always address functional deficiencies. Now, what about a borderline deficiency? Now, it's easy to look at a borderline deficiency and say, well, it's almost deficient and it's not quite a functional deficiency, and maybe we don't need to address that. I would advise a word of caution with that thought process and rather implore you to think that if you see a borderline deficiency, this is also a time for action, but it implies something different. Instead, what it suggests is that when the body is under a state of stress, more specifically when a metabolic pathway that requires a borderline deficiency is under a state of stress, that pathway is not going to be as efficient. There's not going to be an adequate amount of that borderline nutrient when this pathway is being stressed. And maybe the point that's most important to note about this is that those borderline deficiencies are onsetting, they're manifesting because these pathways are under stress. So what that means is that we want to not only address functional deficiencies, we also want to address borderline deficiencies. And I'll give you even one clue further into this initial interpretation process. It's important to not just simply look at a functional deficiency and a borderline deficiency as they're listed out. We also want to go the next step, and we want to look at the graphs in these reports. We want to look at the trends on some of these nutrients. For example, you may have a nutrient that is of sufficient status still based on the way that it's listed. However, it may be just above borderline. That is also a nutrient that you should consider. And you'll understand more as we go into additional videos in this series that when it comes to functional deficiencies and borderline deficiencies, and even some of these that are trending towards an insufficient status, ultimately the goal of what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at these nutrients collectively and see what nutrient deficiency patterns we can isolate, because this is ultimately going to allow us to know what systems to put the most attention towards. So with this in mind, we want to look at functional deficiencies, we want to look at borderline deficiencies, and we also want to look at those that are trending towards a state of insufficiency, although they may be still labeled as sufficient. Now, I want to say one final point about these functional versus borderline deficiencies, and this comes to the point of repletion. Is there a difference in repleting these? Well, understand that again, the functional deficiency has already reached a point of impairing metabolic pathways in a constant state. Again, there's never enough of these nutrients available to keep these metabolic pathways optimal. So with that in mind, we're going to use a higher level of supplementation to replete these functional deficiencies as compared to when we're talking about a borderline deficiency. Is there a rough estimate on how we differentiate the dosing on this? Well, there's honestly not, but if we need a good general rule of thumb to be able to work with, we should thinking about a 2-to-1 ratio would be ideal, meaning that we would use about twice as much of a particular nutrient to replete a functional deficiency versus a borderline deficiency. Let me provide an example of this just for clarity, if I might. For someone who has, for example, a coenzyme Q10 deficiency, for a borderline deficiency level, we may look at repleting 100 milligrams of ubiquinone. For someone with a functional deficiency of coenzyme Q10, we may look at repleting 200 milligrams of ubiquinone instead. So it really, again, this is more of a rule of thumb than it is a hard and fast rule, but it's a very good starting point, and clinical scenarios would obviously dictate how we would adjust these various dosing levels. But the point being on this is that functional deficiencies imply greater level of deficiency versus a borderline, but yet we still need to be attentive to these borderline as well as these trending deficiencies. So with that in mind, we'll talk next about how to look at the different ways of interpretation. So stay tuned, that's on the way.